Great. Well, thank you. I'm Ed Levin, Director of the Center on Addiction and Behavior Change at Duke University here and part of DIBS. And we're having our seminar series now. And before I introduce today's speaker, I just wanted to look ahead. On your screen is the listings of the remaining seminars, and we're kind of right in the middle. We've had several weeks right in a row, but now we're going to have the next one on March 10th. Stacy Bilbo from the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience is going to talk about her work with neuroglial interactions and substance use disorders. And then Kathleen Kantak from Boston University is going to follow up on the 24th to look at extinction memory enhancement and cocaine relapse prevention. And then Nicole Shamsapeda, Associate Director of the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences, is going to speak about her work about relationship between mental health services and law enforcement in Durham County, especially with regard to drug abuse. And then finally, Isaac Lipkis from the School of Nursing is going to talk about perceived risks of water pipe tobacco smoking among young adults. And then that'll do it for this semester, although I'm putting together next semester's seminar schedule. So if anyone has a desire to give a talk or desires to us to bring in somebody, well, we don't actually bring them in, we're going to all Zoom still, but have a guest speaker from outside, please let me know. edlevin@duke.edu is my email address. Now, I'm also going to mention after the talk today, we're going to have an hour available with the speaker for informal discussion. So just keep on this Zoom call, and we'll continue on after her presentation for some individual or small group discussion. So now it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Erica Bloom, who is a behavioral social scientist at the RAND Institute. She earned her PhD in clinical psychology and also a master's in clinical psychology at the University of South Florida, and her bachelor's degree at Brown University. And she's been at RAND for a couple of years. Before that, she was on the faculty at Brown University, and she has broad interest in increasing effectiveness and access to and uptake of new treatments, especially kind of personal computer or personal data assistant help with people trying to overcome substance abuse disorders. So today she's going to speak to us about QuitBet. QuitBet, a digital social game that pays you to stop smoking, and this research is funded by a NIDA SBIR award. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I can share my screen now. Thank you so much for that introduction. This works, hopefully. All right, can everyone see those slides?
Yeah, that's good. Yep.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me today. I was telling Ed and Tyler before we started that I was really looking forward to taking a trip to Duke. This has been planned since before COVID. And at the time, I thought for sure that by the time spring 2021 rolls around, you know, the world will be back to normal, whatever that means. But here we are, Zoom it is, and that's okay. I am really happy to be here today and excited to give this talk. So I'm going to jump right into it. Let's see. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because Ed already introduced me and my background and just repeats what he said. So I got my PhD from USF. I was mentored by Tom Brandon, who is the most wonderful mentor. I have to give him a shout out. And then spent a long time on the faculty at the medical school at Brown. And then recently, a couple of years ago, moved to my current position at RAND. I'm a behavioral social scientist. And I understand that people may be curious about RAND and what it's like to work there. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in the second hour. RAND is a nonprofit research institute and does work on basically everything. And there's a huge health division. Okay, so here are the funding sources I'll mention in my talk today and my disclosures. All right, and here's the agenda for my talk today. So first, I am going to spend a little time telling you about SBIRs and STTRs. I realize that not everyone may be familiar with that grant program. Then I'll tell you about some foundational work that I did in smoking cessation and how I ended up partnering with a startup company on an SBIR. Then I'll tell you about the main topic for today, the QuitVet SBIR, including the aims of that grant and some results. And then finally, at the end, I'll talk a little bit about writing SBIRs, if that's something you're interested in, and some tips and considerations. So what is SBIR? SBIR stands for Small Business Innovation Research, and STTR is Small Business Technology Transfer. The SBIR STTR program is America's Seed Fund, and the purpose of this program is to provide funding to small businesses to conduct research focused on the development of products with the potential for commercialization. For the purpose of SBIR STTR, a small business is defined as one that is operating within the United States and has 500 or fewer employees. And there are some other specific criteria you can check out on the website. And I know most of us are probably focused on NIH, but there are many other federal agencies that participate in the SBIR STTR program. Some of my colleagues at RAND have been involved in SBIRs funded by other agencies, including the Department of Education. So the NIH SBIR STTR program consists of 3 phases. And the budget limits listed here increased recently, but NIH has not yet updated this part of their website. So I put the current limits on the side of the slide. So the first phase of SBIR focuses on small projects that establish initial feasibility and proof of concept. Phase 2 is the next step, larger awards to continue testing a product that had been developed in phase 1. And NIH accepts fast track proposals that combine phase 1 and phase 2, with phase 2 funding being contingent upon meeting milestones that you proposed for phase 1. However, NIH also accepts proposals for phase 1 only or phase 2 only. And you can only apply for a phase 2 award if you've already received a phase 1 award. And finally, phase 3 focuses on commercialization, and NIH does not participate in phase 3. And I'll also say that, so SBIRs and STTRs must be awarded to a small business, which means that they cannot be awarded to an academic institution. However, both SBIRs and STTRs allow for collaboration and subcontracting with academic institutions. So that is how I became involved in SBIRs and STTRs. And I'm not going to go into the differences between these because I wanted to focus mostly on the QuitVet work. But the primary difference is that STTR allows more of the budget to go towards the academic institution than does the SBIR. And STTRs also require an academic partner, whereas in an SBIR, it's optional. And if you have more questions about that, I'd be happy to talk about that at the end. And then in terms of the grant proposal itself, it looks very similar to a traditional R award. If you're applying for a phase 2, you additionally have to include a component called the commercialization plan, which is basically a second grant where you talk about how you're going to commercialize your product. But the research strategy part looks very much like any other R grant. All right. Oops. Okay, so now I'm going to take a step back and tell you about my foundational work in smoking cessation that eventually led to the QuitVet SBIR. The cigarette smoking rate in the US has been declining for decades, and in 2017 reached a record low of 14%, remaining at 14% in 2019. Nevertheless, tobacco use remains the leading cause of preventable death, and smoking rates are much higher in some populations, including individuals of low socioeconomic status and those who have psychiatric and substance use disorders. There are 7 FDA-approved medications for smoking cessation, as well as evidence-based behavioral treatments. However, recent declines in smoking seem to be accounted for more by decreasing rates of smoking initiation than by increasing rates of quitting. Our existing treatments do work, but not that well, and few people use them. In my profession of clinical psychology, we are traditionally trained to focus on this part. That is, on the development of new treatments and testing their efficacy in well-controlled clinical trials. However, my experiences during the past few years led me to start paying a lot more attention to this part, And that is a key part of this SBIR story. I now think about this problem as an upside down pyramid. I had been very focused on the bottom part, but to maximize total impact, we need to start at the top. The most effective treatment in the world is meaningless if no one is using it. So towards the end of graduate school, I developed an interest in the relationship between smoking and weight. Nicotine is an appetite suppressant and increases metabolism. Most women and some men report that they smoke at least in part to help control their weight, and they are afraid of gaining weight if they quit. Indeed, most people who quit smoking do gain some weight. A number of treatment approaches intended to minimize weight gain or reduce the degree to which concern about weight gain is a barrier to quitting have been tested, but for the most part have not produced better outcomes than standard treatments. In 2013, I received a K23 award from NIDA to develop and conduct a preliminary trial of a novel group-based distress tolerance treatment for weight concern and smoking cessation among women. Unfortunately, the results indicated that, consistent with past research, the novel treatment wasn't more effective than standard treatment. However, there were plenty of valuable lessons. The quit rates were very low overall, confirming that weight-concerned smokers have a lot of difficulty in quitting. Also, I gained new insights into the power of group dynamics and the value of group support and their potential to overwhelm any effects of specific treatment content. So back in 2014, which is the same time that I was in the early stages of the We Quit project, I came up with an idea for another treatment approach for weight-concerned smokers that was very different from what I was testing in We Quit. I obtained funding from the Rhode Island Foundation to conduct a small pilot trial. In this study, called Project Wager, I tested a contingency management approach. Contingency management, or CM for short, refers to reinforcing target behaviors with financial incentives. Many studies have shown that CM is effective for smoking cessation and weight loss independently. Project Wager was the first study to test whether CM could be used to prevent or reduce weight gain after smoking cessation. In CM studies for smoking cessation, self-reports of quitting are objectively verified with breath carbon monoxide, CO testing. Breath CO is elevated in people who smoke compared to those who don't. And CO drops into the non-smoker range within about 24 hours after quitting. So frequent up to daily testing is really necessary. So Wager was an intensive protocol involving 25 in-person visits over a 12-week period. Results indicated that this protocol was feasible and acceptable, but the study was not powered to evaluate efficacy. One of the biggest lessons I learned from both We Quit and Wager was that intensive in-person tobacco treatments are extremely difficult to implement in real-world settings, and therefore are rarely available, at least not in the United States. In the specific case of contingency management, there are three primary problems. First, we have to figure out who is going to pay for the incentives. Related to that, what do we do about relapse after the incentives are inevitably discontinued? Finally, with money on the line, we cannot rely on self-reports of quitting, but no one has time to visit a clinic every day to get their breath tested. So it's not real-world ready. And I learned all this the hard way because at the same time that I was conducting the We Quit and Wager studies, I was also working 1 day per week in a primary care practice providing smoking cessation counseling. It was my first clinical position in which I was required to bill insurance. And I quickly discovered that intensive evidence-based tobacco treatments are not compatible with real-world logistics and billing codes. As a result of this frustrating experience, I joined the Business Practices Committee of the Association for the Treatment of Tobacco Use and Dependence, ATUD. And I led this ATUD committee in conducting a survey study of billing practices among US tobacco treatment providers. Results of this study confirmed my experience was common and that clinicians in the United States weren't engaging in fee-for-service billing for tobacco cessation because of these challenges. However, some other countries outside the United States have been able to offer intensive treatment in community settings. In particular, the UK has been offering individual and group treatment through their Stop Smoking Services programs for over 20 years. So I recently co-authored I recently co-authored this paper, also with the Etude Business Practices Committee, in which we reviewed outcomes of group treatment delivered in real-world settings, mostly in the UK. And in every study, group was always at least as good as individual and often outperformed individual, which was more evidence that there's value in group-based treatment. Okay, so that's the background, and that brings me to the SBIR story. In the fall of 2014, as I had mentioned before, I submitted the proposal for Wager to the Rhode Island Foundation. And while I was waiting to hear if this grant would be funded, in early 2015, I contacted a program officer at NIDA to discuss the idea for Wager because I planned to submit an NIH grant later. And the program officer liked it a lot, but he said that NIH was no longer interested in funding traditional CM because it wasn't real world ready. So I had to figure out a way to improve implementation potential. I was discouraged, but I was determined. So I started thinking and searching, and eventually I stumbled upon the website for a startup company called WayBetter. WayBetter was offering a unique real-world CM program directly to the public that addressed all three of the problems with CM that I mentioned on the previous slide. Jamie Rosen founded WayBetter in 2011. WayBetter's first product was DietBet, a weight loss game that uses a form of CM called a deposit contract. DietBet players are required to pay a deposit, which WayBetter calls their bet, of their own money to enter a DietBet game, which can have an unlimited number of players. All players in the game have the same weight loss goal. For example, in DietBet Kickstarter games, the goal is to lose 4% of their body weight in 4 weeks. At the end of the game, all players who succeed split the pot of money that was bet at the game start. So the game winners get back their entire bet plus extra money that is funded by the forfeited bets of the players who didn't meet the goal. Players also receive access to a discussion forum where they can post messages to each other and provide social support, and there's also a game host. Some DietBet games have been hosted by fitness and nutrition experts and celebrities. Following the success of DietBet, WayBetter launched additional games targeting physical activity and has had over 1 million unique paying players to date. In all games, outcomes are objectively verified. For example, in DietBet, players must submit pictures of themselves on a scale with their weight visible. WayBetter has operated with 2 different business models. For some games, they retain a small share of the pot, but forfeit their share in the unlikely event that all players in the game are winners. So winners are guaranteed not to lose any money. Other games operate on a membership model. At the time I discovered WayBetter, I noticed that they had already published a paper describing the outcomes of DietBet, an indication that perhaps they were open to partnering with academia. Okay, so we're ready for the next part of the story. So there was some serendipity in this part. So I noticed that WayBetter's website said that they were partnering with Trisha Leahy, who is a weight loss expert and psychologist, and at the time was on the faculty at Brown, same place I was. So I contacted Trisha and she connected me to Jamie. And she and Jamie agreed to collaborate with me on an NIH grant submission to test a new version of Wager that was adapted from the DietBet model. Unfortunately, this grant was not funded. However, I remained convinced that there was value here. And in 2017, Jamie invited me to work for WayBetter as a consultant and help develop a program called QuitBet that would only target smoking cessation. So we put the weight maintenance piece aside. And I accepted this offer and worked with Jamie to develop a QuitBet prototype and conduct a small test game. So now I'm going to tell you about that test game, which was before the SBIR. So this was the original QuitBet website that was built for the test game. And this was the original design of the QuitBet test game. So as it turns out, in 2015, Bedfont released a portable smartphone connected CO testing device called the ICO. And the ICO is available directly to the public for $60. And this is what it looks like. The breath test result is shown on the smartphone screen, and the ICO automatically generates an email with the result that can be sent to any address. And the ICO is really what made QuitBet possible, because before the ICO, breath testing devices were very expensive, and it really wasn't feasible to send hundreds of people a breath testing device. They cost over $500. So the bet for QuitBet was $30, and the game lasted for 4 weeks. Week 1 was a practice week to prepare for quitting. The official quit day was day 8. And then between day 9 and 28, players tested their breath carbon monoxide once per day between noon and midnight, and they earned back $1 a day for each day that their CO was 6 parts per million or less, which is the standard cutoff that is used to separate the smoking range from the non-smoking range. All remaining bet money at the end went into a grand prize pot. And players who had submitted a CO test of 6 ppm or less on at least 19 of the 20 days that were between day 9 and 28, so they were allowed 1 lapse day, they were declared winners, and they split the remainder of the grand prize pot. One problem with the ICO is that while it is in use, the smartphone's camera is disabled. So there was no way to take a photo or video or otherwise verify the person's identity during the testing. And we were concerned that players could simply have a friend or family member who is not a smoker take the test for them. For the 2017 test game, we came up with a crude workaround for this that we called the 360 video. And you'll see that's me in my house demonstrating this 360 video. But we did not use this method in the SBIR, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. And you'll see over here on the right side of the screen, this is what the email looks like that is generated directly from the ICO. So I didn't have to type this myself. It's automatically generated, which is really nice. Okay, so we conducted this test game in a private Facebook group, and we recruited 32 players, of whom 47% ended up being winners. And you can see here that there was a bimodal distribution where there were some players who didn't submit any tests, and then the winners over here. And in addition to the CM component, players, like the other Way Better games, could also engage in discussion in the Facebook group. And I served as the game host and provided players with some basic smoking cessation education and other discussion topics. And then we had some game referees from Way Better who tracked the CO test submissions. And I should point out that this was not an academic research study. This was done in the context of business. Okay, let's see. So we're back to the road to SBIR, the final part. So after we finished the test game, Way Better decided that they wanted to continue to pursue QuitBet and invited me to partner with them on an SBIR grant submission. And we submitted that grant in September of 2018. It was reviewed in November of 2018 and scored in the fundable range, but as we all know with NIH, nothing is guaranteed until you receive the notice of award. And then in April of 2019, I started my job at RAND. And the SBIR was finally funded on July 1st, 2019. And fortunately, the process of transferring my effort from Brown to RAND proceeded relatively smoothly. Because at the time I started my position at RAND, it was still kind of uncertain how we were going to handle it, but we figured it out and hooray, we did it. Okay. So now I'm going to tell you about the grant. So this is a fast track SBIR, which means that we applied for both phases at the same time, and we have already completed phase 1. So I'm going to share the phase 1 results with you. And we have submitted a manuscript for publication of phase 1 and have received a revise and resubmit. So we are hopeful that it will be published soon, but it's not out there quite yet. So during phase 1, we took QuitBet off Facebook and built a QuitBet app on Way Better's mobile platform. So the same platform that they use for their other apps. And we conducted a pilot trial with 50 players. And the main difference between the 2017 test game, other than removing it from Facebook, and this trial, was that we integrated CO testing into the QuitBet app so that the app recorded a video of the player's face as they exhaled into their ICO. And this was how we verified identity. So you can see me demonstrating it over here. This is what it looked like when you got your result and then you submitted the test. And we retained the other elements from the test game, including the social feed and the game host. Sandra Japuntic, who was a co-investigator on this study, and I served as the hosts. And the QuitBet app also included a leaderboard on which players could view the results in real time, including their own CO test results. So on the first screen here, you see the numbers in green and red. So the red ones are CO tests that were over the cutoff, meaning they represented smoking, and the green were the days where they were under the cutoff. So those were the days they were earning money. And then the last screen over here showed them how many players showed them how many tests of 6 parts per million or less each other player had submitted, so they could see who was still in the running to be a winner. Okay. So in a phase 1 SBIR, you must propose to meet specific milestones in your grant. And so the first milestone from our grant was to complete development of the app. And we did it. We did that by October of 2019. These projects are also very fast. Phase 1 awards typically last 6 months, and ours was awarded for 6 months, and we did end up taking a 3-month extension, but we only ended up needing about a month of that. So I'm really very proud of us that we basically did this in 7 months. All right. Our next milestone was to recruit 50 players within 1 month for the pilot trial, which we thought would provide some indication that we can recruit and there's some market interest here. And we recruited primarily by sending messages to WayBetter's databases and posting in WayBetter games and social media accounts. So this was a sample of convenience. We had to do this very quickly and with a very low budget. But we did do some paid Facebook advertising as well. And all of the ads for the study contained a link to the QuitBet website, which had a link to an anonymous screening survey. And that screening survey was accessed and completed 687 times, of which 235 of them were eligible. And the eligibility criteria were really basic. So we recruited people who were smoking at least 10 cigarettes a day, lived in the continental United States, and a couple of other basic criteria, but there were almost no other exclusions here. And since this was a public screening survey and could be completed an unlimited number of times by the same person, we have no way of knowing how many unique individuals this represented. However, we do know that of those 235 eligible surveys, there were 106 unique individuals that then proceeded to a consent form. So we were able to automate this entire process. They filled out the screening survey, and then they got an automated message that said eligible or not. And the eligible message had a link to the consent form. So then they proceeded to the consent form. They read it themselves. They signed it by typing their name into a box. And then of those 106 who consented, 77 completed a baseline survey, 50 paid their bet, and then we actually ended up running 2 different games. The first 23 players to enroll in the study got put into game 1, and the last 27 got put into game 2. And then, so that was 50 players total, and among those, 37 completed a survey at the end, and 24 did an interview by phone. And you can see here, these were the characteristics, and we were not particularly surprised by this because we were expecting a sample that reflected people who had previously played diet bet, step bet, or run bet. So it reflected the population that WayBetter was currently reaching at that time. So mostly women, I would say relatively high in income and education compared to what we typically see in studies with people who smoke. And almost all of the players were white. Okay. But we achieved that milestone. Okay, so the next milestones were that at least 50% of the players, oops, 1 second. Okay, the next milestone was that at least 50% of the players, I am messed up. Okay, here we go, would submit a CO test regardless of the results, so whether they were smoking or not, on at least 75% of the game days. And unfortunately, this is a milestone that we did not meet. Only 38% of players did that. And that was because very few tests that were greater than 6 parts per million indicating smoking were submitted. And we think that this happened for a couple of reasons. So first, there was no financial incentive to submit a test if you were still smoking. And submitting a test did take a little bit of time. The test itself is very quick. That's like a minute, but it did take up to 5 minutes to upload the video. And we realized that people thought that that just wasn't worth their time if they weren't going to get any money for it. So we have a couple of solutions here that we're considering for future phases. And One would be to compress the videos to make sure that they upload faster than 5 minutes. And second is to consider some sort of incentive, like a lottery, for CO test submission independent of the results. So to encourage people to participate even if they're still smoking. Okay, so our next milestones were that at least 50% would be interested in playing a second quit bet, and at least 75% would recommend quit bet to others. And indeed, we more than met that milestone. So of the people who completed the post quit bet survey, 95% of them, which was 70% of the 50 players, said that they were interested in playing a second quit bet, and the same number said that they would recommend quit bet to others. So overall, people seem to like this game and want to play again, and also thought other people would like it. Okay, so we also had some secondary milestones about the smoking behavior results. And the reason that these are secondary is, again, this was not powered to evaluate efficacy, but we did propose some milestones about this. And our first secondary milestone was that at least 30% of the players would be winners. And we selected that 30% number for a few reasons. I feel like that's kind of a benchmark in smoking cessation, that like the best treatments we have in gold standard clinical trials tend to achieve a quit rate of 30%. So that's why we picked that. And we did meet that milestone, hooray. So 34% or 17 of the players across both games were winners. And there were a few more winners in game 1 than in game 2. So the game 2 players won a little bit more money than the game 1 players. And among those 17 winners, 8 had the allowed lapse day. And I can tell you a little bit more about that. The lapse days were not necessarily days where they actually smoked. In some cases, they just forgot to submit their test that day or something else happened. But they were still winners. And you'll see that similar to the test game, we also had a bimodal distribution in this game where they were clustered at here and here. And again, that's because people who were still smoking in general just stopped submitting tests. All right. So more secondary milestones, these were our last ones, was that at least 50% would make a serious quit attempt, which we defined as submitting at least one test during the game that was 6 parts per million or less, suggesting that they'd abstained from smoking for at least one day. And also that at least 50% would reduce their smoking by at least 50% from their pre-quit bet level. And we met both of those milestones. So 64% submitted at least one test that was 6 ppm or less, and 52% submitted tests of 6 ppm or less on at least 2 consecutive days. So that's even a stronger suggestion that they abstained from smoking for at least 24 hours. And 50%, so 25, reduced their smoking by at least 50%. And we got that from the post-quit bet survey data. And we did like an intent to treat analysis. So we assumed that anyone who didn't answer that survey had not changed their smoking from baseline. And 13 of those 25 reported no smoking at all in the past week on the post-quit bet survey. And the post-quit bet survey was sent out right after the games ended, but we did allow people to complete it for up to a couple of weeks. So people completed it at different times. Eventually we cut it off and we said, okay, if you don't complete it by this date, we won't allow you to complete it anymore. So it didn't necessarily overlap with the game. It depended on when they completed it. Here's some other results from the post-quit bet survey and interview. So about 50% experienced some kind of technical difficulty with the ICO or the app. But most of these problems were minor and easily resolved. One of the most common problems that occurred was having trouble getting the app to recognize the ICO and make that connection so that they could start their test. And what that usually meant was that they had to restart the app a couple times or reboot their phone or something like that. But the good news is that no player said that they were prevented from being a winner because of a technical difficulty. So there were a few cases where the lapse day was because of a technical difficulty, but again, nobody had that happen enough where they said, that's why I wasn't a winner. So that was good. And then they had some suggestions, the players had some suggestions for us. So They suggested some notification functions in the discussion forum. And this is something that we had planned to include, but just didn't happen for the pilot because this was such a quick study and we just did not have enough time to program that part. But basically getting a notification on their phone that someone had posted something or replied to their post, because otherwise they would have no way of knowing unless they logged in. So we didn't see as active a discussion as we had hoped for. And then incentives for participation, which I had mentioned on a previous slide. So encouraging people to continue participating even if they have not quit smoking yet. And we're hopeful that if we do that, that perhaps that will lead people to continue trying to quit and ultimately quit. And then some of our players noted that they were not interested at all in the social feed or any of the education elements, that they were just there for the money, and that was okay. They liked the money part. So we plan to assess interest in the social feed in our next phase and look at that as a possible moderator of the outcomes. And then you see on the right side here some player feedback. So we asked them to rate a number of aspects of the game. And for the most part, a higher score on these means more positive or better. So you can see that most of the ratings were at least 3 and most were between 3 and 4. So that is in the agree range. So they were overall satisfied. They thought the game rules were clear. They thought, so this is interesting, 28 days is a good length. So they, for the most part, agreed, but everyone who disagreed with this wanted a longer game. And the reason that we didn't make it longer is that ideally, if this becomes a real product in the real world, that people could play a series of consecutive games and make the game as long as they want. And there would be 2 different types of games. So there would be games for people who are still smoking at the beginning and they're trying to quit for the first time. And then there would be maintenance games where people who had quit in a previous quit bet could continue playing for relapse prevention. So, so this is kind of a confusing question in that sense, because ideally the game could be longer by stringing together consecutive games. And other way better players in other games do that. So people play a series of consecutive diet bet games or step bet games. They thought that, yay, that the host, which was me and my colleague Sandra, were supportive and helpful. Other players were supportive, that the game helps them quit, and that this is good, that this is low. They had very little concern that any player tried to cheat. And we have very little concern about that as well. We feel that if there was a lot of cheating, the win rate would have been much higher. Okay, so some other considerations for phase 2. So I was very disappointed with the lack of diversity in the sample for this pilot trial. But as I already mentioned, at the same time, I was not that surprised, given that our main recruitment strategy was to advertise this to people who had already played a way better game. So for phase 2, we will still be recruiting some from Waybetter's player databases, but we'll be using a number of other strategies to reach a broader population that better reflects the population of people who smoke. And our team is thinking very deeply and thoughtfully about this. And during our time for discussion after my talk, I welcome your suggestions about how we can reach a more diverse population. Something else that we're considering, a major change to the design of the game, is to reduce or eliminate that warm-up week, as a number of players expressed that they did not like that. They wanted to just jump right in, they were ready, and they wanted to quit right away. And that seems to be consistent with other research on smoking cessation apps, where people download them and want to use them when they're ready to quit. They don't want to go through a pre-quit phase. And I found that very interesting because that is the opposite of what I've noticed when doing in-person work, where in an in-person study, people are glad that they have time to prepare for quitting and often aren't ready the first day. So it's an interesting difference from an in-person treatment. All right. So for phase 2, this is our plan. We are going to conduct a much larger randomized trial of QuitBet versus an alternative version of QuitBet that we're calling NS, which is no social elements. So the deposit contract only. So unlike a traditional CM study where they typically test money versus no money, we are not doing that. And that is because so many studies have already shown that money works. So we felt that that would not be very innovative if we did that. What we really want to know is, do all of the other elements of QuitBet matter other than the money? So that's what we're testing. Like, what does that social component add? And our primary hypothesis is that abstinence rates will be higher in QuitBet versus the QuitBet NS. And our secondary hypothesis is that QuitBet participants will be more likely to play a second game, report greater reductions in smoking, and be more likely to use smoking cessation medication. So I'll point out that There are no restrictions on other treatment in QuitVet. You can use whatever you want, and this is designed to be compatible with any other treatment. So you can use any medication you want, you can be getting other counseling, there's no restrictions on that. We'll also examine potential mediators of outcomes such as motivation to quit, engagement in the game, satisfaction, and interest in the social feed. As I mentioned before, we would test as a moderator. So what's going on with phase 2? It was funded on April 15th, 2020. Now you all know what was happening on April 15th, 2020. It was not a great time for the world. So we were supposed to begin recruitment in the fall of 2020, and it was delayed for a number of reasons. So again, because the world turned upside down and everything that's going on, we encountered a number of challenges. I was also on maternity leave in the fall of 2020. So that was another hurdle that we had to get past. But we are hoping to start recruitment soon. One of the challenges is that we're waiting to receive the iQuote. So this device that I mentioned was discontinued in early 2020, and a new version is coming out called the iQuit, and we're waiting to receive those. So our plan is that we're hopefully going to start recruiting later this year, hopefully mid-2021. And when I initially scheduled this talk, I was hoping to be able to provide you with some phase 2 data, but it did not happen, and that is okay. All right, so for the last part of my talk here, last few minutes, I'm going to talk about some considerations in SBIRs and STTRs. So the first thing to think about here is the budget. So the budgeting for SBIRs is different from standard R grants for a couple of reasons. So first of all, I mentioned that a specific percentage is allowed to be allocated to the academic partner. And in the case of an SBIR, up to 33% of the phase 1 budget can be allocated to the academic partner. And then in phase 2, up to 50% can. So you have to think about those numbers carefully when you're doing your budget and make sure that the proportions are within the limits. And then secondly, the budget includes both direct costs and indirect costs. So you have to factor in the indirect costs as well, which is something that is different from a traditional R grant. Second, you have to consider grant writing experience and division of writing labor. So in my case, I'm partnering with a small business who they're not researchers, they're not scientists, so they don't write grants. So we had to figure out, how much training and teaching was I going to do, how much of the writing was I going to do versus them. Thinking about publishing and making sure that you'll be able to publish the data no matter what the results say. That is often important in academia. And also considering relevant institution policies. As you can imagine, you have to consider conflicts of interest and all sorts of those sorts of things here, intellectual property rights and all of that. And I will say that I have no conflict of interest currently with Way Better. All of my funding for this comes from the SBIR. All right. So identifying potential partners at small businesses. So my story, as I mentioned, had kind of a serendipitous aspect to it, but you can also pursue this more actively, and I have done that. I have not partnered with any other companies yet, but have made some connections and hope to do that in the future. So through networking, conferences, and Twitter has been a great source of information for me in learning about companies that are doing interesting digital health work. So I'll show you some of the conferences and programs that I have attended in the recent past, in the past couple of years, where I have been able to network with people in this industry. So some of these conferences were a mix of academia and industry. Some were primarily more industry. I also have a couple of suggestions there for people to follow on Twitter. I find Chrissy Farr is a former CNBC reporter and current health tech investor, and I find her tweets very informative. She is on top of the digital health world and what's going on. And SBM, the Society of Behavioral Medicine, also has a special interest group in digital health, and their tweets are also informative, and many, many others. All right. And that's it. So I've got my contact information there, and I just point out that my email is formatted differently here, but they both work. So Erica_Bloom at RAND or this one, they both work. And I also, of course, want to acknowledge my collaborators on this work. So Jamie Rosen, the CEO of Way Better, Alexis Piero, who is our wonderful project manager, the whole engineering team at Way Better, Sandra DePuncic at Hennepin Healthcare, Jesse Dallery at University of Florida, and Trisha Leahy at University of Connecticut. They all contributed to this.
Thank you so much. That was really very interesting, and it reminds me of what they actually call now implementation science. So as much as we might think we understand how things work, until we can actually get them to work in the real world, they really don't come to much. So this is really very innovative thinking and actually application into actually getting things to work. So we do have some time for talk, for discussion, and just want to remind people after this, we will have another hour to have informal discussion. But now to the meat of the talk, I actually had a question in terms of people who are failures, at least initial failures. You know, in usual medicine, if one treatment doesn't work, you keep at it until something does. And unfortunately, with drug addiction research and practice, actually, you know, the treatment failures kind of fall off the screen. So have you thought about maybe giving some reimbursement, albeit less, to people who actually don't meet the cut, who've had a failure experience, just to keep them engaged and to, realize that you haven't made the mark this time, but let's try again.
Yes, so that is a great question. And part of what we realized in doing this was that there wasn't any incentive to continue playing once you became ineligible to be a winner. So after you had 2 lapse days. So what we are planning on doing in phase 2, we haven't quite worked out the details, but offering some sort of lottery incentive for submitting the test, even if you're still smoking. And so hopefully that will motivate people to stay engaged, knowing that they could win a significant prize if they continue to submit their tests, even if they're still smoking.
Yeah, well, thanks. Do you have other questions, Jed?
Well, just a quick question. Thanks for the very clear presentation. And I was wondering about if there were any time of day restrictions on when participants submitted their carbon monoxide reading, because, one can imagine if it's totally left up to them, that someone who smokes, in, let's say, the evening hours could submit a clean sample, in the early afternoon, then go on to smoke, a fair part of the rest of the day, but then be abstinent enough to come in under the cutoff the next day. Is it left up to them when they submit their sample?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so the reason that the testing, they were able to choose. So they had to submit a test between noon and midnight each day, and they could choose whatever time they wanted. So one day they could submit it at 12:02 right afternoon, and the next day wait till the nighttime. They could do whatever they wanted. And you're right that this did potentially allow for people to smoke at low levels and time their tests right, because we only did 1 test per day. And other digital contingency management studies in the past did 2 tests per day to try to prevent that. And we believe that that did happen. We also have some evidence that happened. I didn't go into those details, but we asked people, was there ever a day where your test was 6 or less, but you did smoke some? And some people said yes, it was typically like 1 or 2 cigarettes. And we are okay with that because, first of all, that's a significant reduction from what they were doing before. And second of all, we feel that if this was a big problem where people were sneaking all kinds of cigarettes, the win rate would have been much higher. That, remember, still only 1/3 of the players were winners. So people were not able to game the system, so to speak, enough to really get the win rate up. So we think that even if people were still smoking a little bit, like, it was a significant reduction from what they were doing before. And for a real world product, we think that is valuable in itself, that's an acceptable outcome. And I'll also say that, like, that can happen in every study that does CO testing, including in-person studies where they're only coming in once a day, or any study where they're using CO as an outcome. Someone may have smoked at a low level but still passed the CO cutoff. But that's a great question.
Well, actually, you raise a good point, because I think the standard for abstinence determination in studies that use CO is a self-report of no smoking corroborated by CO, but
yes,
it always has to include the self-report of not smoking as well.
So we did not include the self-report. We considered that. And I looked into the literature on contingency management for that. And most contingency management studies don't actually get the self-report. They pay solely based on CO test results. And there's a few reasons for that. And one is that it avoids potential conflicts between those two, where someone's like, well, but I really didn't smoke, so why is my CO, over a 6? And that creates a lot of difficulty in figuring out what to do there. So making it solely about the test results keeps it a little bit more objective and kind of prevents some of those issues. But it's certainly something that we thought about and wondered if that would help reduce any low-level smoking. Because again, in this game, if you did smoke a cigarette but your CO was still under a 6, that wasn't cheating. I mean, the game was based only on CO, so that was not cheating.
Right.
But we considered it. We considered having them type in their self-report before taking the CO test. But again, we didn't want to get into a lot of arguments with people about like conflicts between their self-report and their CO.
Right. That makes perfect sense. But the relevance, I think, is just in comparing, quote, success rates against, as we started to do standard treatment, and whereas 30% might be a typical, quote, success rate, a 4-week abstinence rate with a nicotine patch. With Varenicline, one consistent sees about 45–50% abstinence at 12 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, once treatment's taken away, you see relapse with every treatment, which is why I like this notion of successive gains to try to maintain, prevent relapse. But anyway, the current sort of state of the art for smoking abstinence based on self-report and CO would be more like 50% at that comparable time point.
Huh.
And we will have that. So for phase 2, for the follow-ups, that 1, 3, and 6 months, we will have that gold standard of asking the self-report and getting the CO. And that's typically past week. So this was like continuous for the whole game as well. So that was another difference. But yes, I completely agree that they're not totally comparable.
That's great. Jeff, you had a comment?
Yeah, Jeff Georgi. Erica, wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if you are aware if anyone is doing a similar kind of study or approach with alcohol, because we've got already a technology in place called SoberLink that allows the individual to monitor their alcohol intake. They blow into the device 2 to 3 times a day. It takes a picture of their iris. It's really, and I use it clinically all the time, but it's a fascinating thought to see if anybody is already doing using that in the way you're using your process.
So I can't think of any specific studies that are published off the top of my head, but I do believe people are doing that.
Okay, well, I will search because it's really exciting. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, comments? Yeah, Catherine. Can you unmute? Yeah.
I was curious. Yeah, I was curious about the diversity issue, and I was wondering. I thought you said that I believe you said they had to buy the device, the ICO device, and do you think that was one of the hurdles?
Okay. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because I realized I didn't mention we bought that for them. So the only money that they had to spend was the $30 bet. They did not have to buy the $60 ICO. We bought that for them. So they did have to spend $30, but not more than that. And that's something that we're thinking about for the future is, who would pay for the ICO, and potentially an insurance company or some other source would pay for the ICO, and the ICO could be used for multiple games.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and thanks for all the information on the SBIRs as well. That was really interesting to hear from your perspective. I feel like I've always kind of discounted those as something that I'm not interested in, but this perspective really makes it seem like it's something worth pursuing.
Oh, you're
certain
welcome.
Things. Thanks.
Other questions, comments?
Hey, this is Joe. Hey, Erica, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you. It's really exciting to see the application of mobile technology in the context of smoking cessation. And I wonder, could you share, are there other emerging trends that you've seen, new technologies that you're excited about, things that are on the horizon?
Yeah, so I'm seeing so many interesting things out there in digital health generally. In terms of substance use specifically, I think there are a number of novel applications. So there are people doing work on various types of sensors that can sense a behavior based on your wrist movements or other movements of your body. So like detecting smoking based on someone's wrist movements or detecting eating based on that. And there's some very exciting work with those types of sensors. Let's see what else. That's the one that popped into my mind first, but let's see. I mean, for me, like what I like about this the most is the potential for increased access.
Right.
So, you know, we can critique that, you know, this particular study, as I said, did not reach a diverse sample, and that was partially because of the budget constraints and the time constraints. But I think that digital health is often criticized for that, for not reaching a diverse population. But at the same time, I think we have to consider that there are significant challenges in accessing traditional in-person treatments as well that might be just as difficult. And I try to keep that in mind, knowing that I have done a lot of that in-person work and seeing the challenges people have in transportation, childcare, getting themselves there is that I think that there's a lot of potential for this, especially now that smartphone ownership rates just keep going up and they're very, very high now, even among low income populations.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and then I guess another thought that I had is, you know, when we think about making behavior change more durable, I know there was a psychosocial component, there was a group. Have you thought about, and I'm sure you have, incorporating other interventions like mindfulness or, you know, pairing this with a cognitive behavioral therapy?
Yeah, so I didn't go into a whole lot of detail about what Sandra and I posted in the game, but a lot of the content that we posted was kind of basic CBT stuff, like links to websites that have that kind of information and tips for quitting. But yes, what I like about this model is that it really can be paired with any other kind of treatment. So you absolutely could have a host who is a specialist in mindfulness who is presenting that type of content along with the financial aspect of it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's excellent. I mean, sometimes I think, I don't know if we have data on this, but sometimes I've suspected that sometimes CM doesn't always work because the contingencies are external, and it doesn't require as much sort of flexing the self-control muscles as you might if it's completely internally directed. So yeah, it would be interesting to see what would happen if you combined it with other interventions. It's really cool work, though. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
So
And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to stick around for the second half hour, I'm sorry to say, but thank you so much for your talk today.
Welcome.
Good. Other comments, questions? I had one final question before we get into the informal talk. Was as an older guy, age effect function. So did you notice, you know, it seems like younger folks would be more comfortable with this sort of health or e-health device than the older folks. Is that what you found?
So we didn't, you know, with this sample is only 50, so we couldn't look at age effects, but the mean age was similar to what is typically seen in smoking cessation trials. I think it was about 40. Let me go find I think our mean age was around 40. So the sample was not young adults. And I want to say, hold on, I pulled up some other, I think I just have the range of age somewhere. Let's see. Yes. Okay. So our participants ranged in age from 28 to 63. So we had a pretty wide age range. And yes, that is true that that smartphone ownership rates are lower among older adults, and they also have lower like digital literacy. And that's something else that is important to me in making sure that ultimately EquipEd is something that is easy to use and accessible to a broad population. So that is something that we have to consider. But often I would think, I mean, again, I don't have the studies in front of me, but I would think that in a lot of these studies, they are more attractive to younger populations. So I was pleased that our mean age kind of matched what you would typically see in a smoking cessation trial, 40.
Great. Okay, so before we close off this part of the interactions, I just wanted to remind people our next seminar is going to be Stacy Bilbo, professor of psychology and neuroscience here at Duke, is going to be speaking on March 10th.